They say you'll understand when you're older. But maybe it's them who needed to learn a lesson. And I was going to be the one to teach it. I stood in front of my childhood home, the brass key cold against my palm, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the driveway, where everything had started to unravel. The house looked the same as it always had, white siding with blue shutters, the oak tree Dad planted when I was born, still standing guard by the front porch. But everything inside those walls had rotted from the inside out, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. My name is Jennifer Hart, and I'm 24 years old. For most of my life, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, gave enough, my mother would finally see me the way she saw my younger sister Amber. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And it took me losing everything to realize that sometimes the only way to win is to walk away and let them destroy themselves. It started when I was 17 and Amber was 15. That was the year our father died suddenly from a heart attack, leaving behind this house, a modest life insurance policy, and 2 daughters who needed their mother more than ever. Mom Denise fell apart in the way that some widows do. She clung to Amber like a life raft and I became invisible. Or worse, I became the workhorse. The responsible one. The one who didn't need anything because I was already so capable. I remember the first real sign, though. I didn't recognize it then. It was 3 months after the funeral. Amber wanted a car for her 16th birthday. Not just any car, but a brand new Honda Civic Silver with leather seats. I was still riding my old 10-speed bike to my part-time job at the grocery store, saving every penny for college because Dad's life insurance barely covered the funeral and immediate bills. When Mom announced she'd bought Amber the car, I felt something crack inside me. But I smiled. I congratulated my sister. I told myself Mom needed to do something that made her happy, that gave her hope. That became my mantra for the next 7 years. Mom needs this. Amber deserves this. Family comes first. I put myself through college, working 2 jobs, taking out loans I'm still paying off. I studied finance and accounting because I was good with numbers, because it was practical, because someone in this family needed to understand how money actually worked. Meanwhile, Amber bounced from major to major, sociology to art history to communications, never settling on anything, never finishing anything. Mom paid for everything without question, draining her savings, maxing out credit cards. When I tried to talk to her about it, she'd wave me off with that same dismissive gesture I'd come to hate. "You're so practical, Jennifer. So sensible. But you need to understand that not everyone is like you. Amber needs support, not judgment." Support. That was Mom's word for enabling. For allowing my 24-year-old sister to live consequence-free while I struggled to make rent in my tiny studio apartment across town, worked 60-hour weeks at the accounting firm, and came home to ramen noodles and exhaustion. The real breaking point started 6 months ago, when Amber announced her engagement to Chase Bennett, her boyfriend of 2 years. Chase was fine, I guess. Good-looking in that generic way, worked in sales for his family's construction company, drove a truck that was always a little too clean. He seemed to genuinely love Amber, which I suppose counted for something. But he also enabled her the same way Mom did, never questioning her spending, never pushing her to be better. The engagement party was at our childhood home, the one Mom still lived in, the one Dad had left to all 3 of us in his will, though nobody ever talked about that. I showed up with a bottle of champagne and a forced smile, ready to play my role as the supportive big sister. Amber showed off her ring, a princess-cut diamond, that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Everyone oohed and awed. Mom cried happy tears. I felt nothing but a cold, spreading numbness. Then came the announcement that made my blood run cold. Amber wanted a destination wedding in the Bahamas. Not a modest beach ceremony, but a full-blown resort wedding at a 5-star property. She'd already done the research, she squealed, showing everyone glossy brochures and Pinterest boards. The package she wanted cost $15,000, not including flights and accommodations for the family. I couldn't help myself. The question burst out before I could stop it. How are we going to afford that? The room went quiet. Amber's face fell. Mom's expression hardened. I saw it then, that look I'd seen 1,000 times before. Disappointment mixed with irritation. How dare I bring up something as crass as money at a moment like this? "We'll figure it out," Mom said firmly. "This is Amber's special day. We'll make it work." "But Mom," I pressed, knowing I should stop but unable to. "You're already carrying credit card debt. The house needs a new roof. We can't afford this. It's insane." Amber's eyes filled with tears right on cue. She was good at that, turning on the waterworks whenever someone questioned her. "You always do this, Jennifer. You always have to ruin everything with your calculations and your negativity. Can't you just be happy for me? I am happy for you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But I'm also trying to be realistic. Maybe we could do something more local, more affordable. You're just jealous, Amber spat out, and there it was, the accusation that had been brewing for years. Jealous because you'll never have a dream wedding like mine. Because you'll never have what I have. I stood there, stunned into silence. Mom didn't defend me. She just wrapped her arms around Amber and glared at me over my sister's shoulder. The message was clear. I was the problem. I was always the problem. I left early that night, driving home in a blur of tears and rage. But I told myself it would be okay. They'd come to their senses. They'd see reason. They had to. They didn't. 2 weeks later, Mom called a family meeting. She asked me to come to the house on a Sunday afternoon, her voice carefully neutral on the phone. I knew something was wrong the moment I walked in and saw the papers spread across the dining room table. Amber sat there with her arms crossed, a defiant look on her face. Mom looked tired, older than her 52 years. What's going on, I asked, though. Part of me already knew. Part of me had been expecting this. I need you to sign something, Mom said, sliding a document across the table toward me. I'm taking out a second mortgage on the house to pay for the wedding and some other expenses. Since your father left the house to all three of us, I need both you and Amber to sign off on it. I stared at the papers like they were a snake about to strike. You're mortgaging Dad's house. The house he left us as security. You're willing to risk losing it for a wedding. It's not just the wedding, Mom said defensively. There are other things. The car payment, Amber's student loans, some medical bills. Medical bills, I picked up the papers, scanning them quickly. My finance degree wasn't for nothing. The amount she wanted to borrow would put the house seriously underwater. The interest rate was terrible. This was financial suicide. Mom, this is a disaster. You'll never be able to pay this back. They're going to take the house. That's not going to happen, Mom said, but her voice wavered. I'll figure it out. I always do. No, you don't, I said, my voice rising. You don't figure it out. You just bury your head in the sand and hope everything works out, and when it doesn't, you make more bad decisions to cover up the first ones. This is insane. I'm not signing this. Amber shot to her feet. See, I told you she'd do this. She wants me to be miserable. She wants to ruin my life because she doesn't have one of her own. That's not fair, I said, but the words felt hollow. Nothing I said would change their minds. They'd already decided I was the villain in their story. Please, Jennifer, Mom said, and for the first time I heard real desperation in her voice. Please. I'm begging you. Don't do this. Don't tear this family apart. I looked at the papers. I looked at my mother's pleading face. I looked at Amber's furious expression. And I felt something inside me give way, not in surrender, but in a kind of grim acceptance. They were going to do this with or without me. If I didn't sign, I'd be the one who destroyed the family. If I did sign, I'd be complicit in their financial ruin. There was no winning. There never had been. Fine, I said, quietly picking up the pen. I'll sign. But when this all falls apart, don't come crying to me. I scrawled my signature across the bottom of the document, each stroke of the pen feeling like a betrayal of everything my father had tried to build for us. Security. Stability. A foundation we could count on. And we were throwing it all away for one day, one party, one moment of borrowed glamour. Amber didn't even thank me. She just grabbed her phone and started texting, probably telling Chase the good news. Mom collected the papers with trembling hands, not meeting my eyes. I left without saying goodbye, driving home with a strange sense of finality settling over me. Something had shifted. Something had broken. And I knew deep in my bones that nothing would ever be the same. Over the next 3 months, I watched from the sidelines as the wedding preparations spiraled out of control. Every time I saw Amber, she had new shopping bags, designer shoes, a spa package, a bachelorette trip to Nashville. The bills kept mounting, and Mom kept paying them, her face growing more drawn and worried with each passing week. I tried to stay out of it. I focused on my work, on my own small life, on pretending that I wasn't watching my family self-destruct in slow motion. But it was impossible to ignore completely. Mom would call me sometimes late at night, her voice tight with stress, asking if I could lend her some money. Just a little. Just to tide her over. I said no every time and hated myself for it. But I had to. If I gave in, if I started bailing them out, it would never stop. Then came the day that changed everything. The day the last thread of my patience finally snapped. I stopped by the house to drop off some paperwork Mom needed for her taxes. I still had my key, so I let myself in, calling out as I entered. Nobody answered. I walked into the kitchen and found Amber sitting at the table surrounded by more shopping bags. She didn't even look up from her phone when I came in. "What's all this?" I asked, though I knew I shouldn't. Knew I should just drop the papers and leave. "Stuff for the wedding," Amber said casually. "Last-minute things." I picked up one of the bags and looked inside. A white sundress with the tag still attached. $800. For a Valentino dress she'd wear once, maybe if at all. $800 while Mom was pulling cash advances from her credit cards to make minimum payments on the mortgage. Something inside me exploded. "Are you kidding me?" I said, my voice shaking. $800 for a dress. Do you have any idea how much debt Mom is in because of you? Do you even care? Amber finally looked up, her expression more annoyed than guilty. "It's not that big of a deal, Jennifer." "God, you're always so dramatic about money." Dramatic? I grabbed the dress, holding it up. "This is dramatic, Amber. This is you spending money that doesn't exist, that Mom doesn't have, that she's borrowing at 20% interest. This is you bleeding this family dry for your own vanity." "Oh, shut up," Amber snapped, standing up. "You're just jealous. You've always been jealous. You can't stand that I'm happy that I'm getting married, that people actually like me. People like you because you buy their affection," I shot back. "Because you've never had to be a real person with real responsibilities. You're 24 years old and you've never held down a job for more than 3 months. You're a child. And you're a bitter old maid," Amber said venomously. "No wonder nobody wants to marry you. Who'd want to spend their life with someone so cold and calculating? You don't have a heart, Jennifer. You just have a calculator where your heart should be." Before I could respond, Mom walked in, her arms full of grocery bags. She took in the scene, the dress in my hands, our furious faces, and her expression immediately hardened. I waited for her to say something, to finally acknowledge what was happening, to take my side just once in my life. "What's going on?" Mom asked, setting down the bags. "Jennifer's attacking me again," Amber said, her voice shifting into that little girl tone she used when she wanted sympathy. "She's trying to ruin my wedding. She's being horrible." Mom turned to me, her eyes cold. "Put the dress down, Jennifer. This isn't your business." Not my business. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mom, you mortgaged Dad's house. You're drowning in debt. Amber just spent $800 on a dress she doesn't need. How is this not my business?" "Because it's not your money," Mom said flatly. "You made it very clear that you weren't going to help. So you don't get a say in how we handle things." I felt like I'd been slapped. "I'm not helping because you're making terrible decisions. I'm not going to throw my money into a black hole." "Then leave," Mom said, and her voice was like ice. "If you can't support your sister, if all you can do is criticize and judge, then leave. We don't need your negativity." I looked at my mother, this woman who had raised me, who I'd sacrificed so much for, who I'd tried so hard to please, and I saw a stranger. Someone who valued appearance over reality, immediate gratification over long-term security, Amber's fleeting happiness over my years of loyalty and hard work. "You know what?" I said, quietly, setting the dress down on the table. "You're right. I should leave. I should have left a long time ago." "Good," Amber said spitefully. "Don't let the door hit you on the way out." But I wasn't done. I turned to my mother one last time. "Dad left that house to all of us. He wanted us to be secure, to have something solid to build our lives on. And you're gambling it all away for one day. One party. When you lose it, and you will lose it, don't call me. Don't ask me to save you. I'm done." "You'll understand when you're older," Jennifer, Mom said, her voice bitter. "When you're alone and you realize that money isn't everything. But by then it'll be too late. You'll be alone." Those words echoed in my head as I walked out of that house for what I thought might be the last time. I drove straight to my apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. Once inside, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt numb, like I was watching my life from a distance. Then the numbness gave way to something else. Something cold and clear and absolutely certain. They wanted to destroy themselves. Fine. But I wasn't going to let them take me down with them. And more than that, I was going to make sure they understood exactly what they were losing. I spent that entire night on my laptop researching. Real estate law. Property rights. Estate law. Mortgage regulations. I read every word of Dad's will, which I'd kept a copy of all these years. I studied the mortgage documents I'd signed. and slowly a plan began to take shape. Dad hadn't just left the house to all of us as joint owners. He'd specifically structured it so that any major financial decisions required unanimous consent. Mom needed my signature to take out that second mortgage, which meant I had just as much right to force a sale as she had to keep it. And given the amount of debt she was carrying, given that she'd almost certainly default on the new mortgage within months, forcing a sale now would at least let us salvage something. More importantly, it would teach them a lesson they desperately needed to learn. Actions have consequences. Choices matter. And you can't just use people and expect them to keep coming back for more. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the entire day on the phone with lawyers. Most of them were sympathetic but discouraging. Family law is messy, they told me. These cases drag on for years. It'll cost you a fortune. It'll destroy what's left of your relationship with your mother and sister. I didn't care about the relationship anymore. It was already destroyed. They'd destroyed it with years of neglect and disrespect and casual cruelty disguised as family obligation. Finally, I found a lawyer who understood. His name was Tom Rodriguez, and he'd handled dozens of partition cases. He listened to my story without interrupting, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. "This is going to get ugly," he said bluntly. "Your mother will fight it. Your sister will hate you. People will call you heartless, greedy, a bad daughter. Can you handle that?" "I've been called worse by the people who are supposed to love me," I said. "At least this way I'll have something to show for it." Tom smiled grimly. "All right then. Let's go to war." We filed the partition lawsuit 3 days later. A partition action, Tom explained, was a legal mechanism that allowed co-owners of property to force a sale when they couldn't agree on how to manage it. Since I was a 1/3 owner of the house, and since Mom had taken out a massive second mortgage without the financial means to pay it back, I had every right to demand that the property be sold and the proceeds divided. The timing was perfect. Amber and Chase had left for the Bahamas 2 days earlier for their pre-wedding week at the resort. Mom had gone with them, of course, maxing out yet another credit card for the flight and accommodations. They were all there, basking in tropical sunshine and wedding excitement, completely oblivious to what was coming. The legal papers were served 3 days into their trip. Tom had arranged for them to be delivered directly to the resort, marked urgent. I wasn't there to see their faces when they opened that envelope, but I imagined it. The confusion giving way to shock, then disbelief, then fury. The frantic phone calls to me, which I didn't answer. The voicemails that piled up in my inbox, each one more hysterical than the last. I listened to them later after I'd had a few glasses of wine. Mom's voice shaking with rage and tears. "How could you do this to us? How could you be so cruel? You're destroying your sister's wedding. Call me back right now." "Right now." Amber's voice shrill and accusing. "You're a monster. You're evil. I hate you. Everyone's going to know what you did. You're going to regret this for the rest of your miserable life." Chase's voice confused and angry. "I don't know what your problem is, Jennifer, but you need to back off. This is between you and your family. Don't drag Amber into it. She's upset. She's been crying all day. Some sister you are." I deleted the voicemails without responding. Let them stew in it. Let them panic. Let them finally understand what it felt like to have your world pulled out from under you without warning. The resort staff must have been thrilled. Nothing says destination wedding drama like legal documents and family warfare. I later heard through Uncle Mike, my father's brother and the only family member who still spoke to me, that the rest of the week was a disaster. Mom and Amber spent most of it on the phone with lawyers of their own, trying to find a way to stop the lawsuit. The other guests picked up on the tension. Chase's family started asking questions. The fairy tale wedding was developing some very ugly cracks. The wedding itself went ahead as planned because what else were they going to do? They'd spent all that money, made all those arrangements. Canceling would have been an admission of defeat. So Amber walked down the aisle on a perfect beach at sunset, wearing her perfect dress surrounded by perfect decorations, and I'm sure the photos looked beautiful. But I also know from Uncle Mike, who attended out of loyalty to his late brother's memory, that the reception was tense. People were whispering. Chase's parents looked uncomfortable. And Amber cried through most of it, though, probably not from happiness. I didn't think about the wedding at all that day. I was busy moving into my new apartment, a tiny 1-bedroom in a better part of town that I'd found and rented with money I'd saved specifically for emergencies. I packed up my old studio, threw away everything that reminded me of the last 7 years of struggle and sacrifice, and started fresh. It felt like shedding a skin I'd been trapped in for too long. When they got back from the Bahamas, Amber came to my office. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was in a meeting with a client when my assistant interrupted, looking flustered. "Jennifer, there's someone here to see you." "She says she's your sister." She's causing a scene in the lobby." I excused myself and went down to find Amber in full meltdown mode. She was crying, shouting, drawing stares from everyone in the building. Security was already approaching, unsure whether to intervene. When she saw me, her face twisted with rage. "You ruined everything," she screamed loud enough that people on the upper floors probably heard her. "My wedding was supposed to be perfect, and you ruined it. Everyone was talking about you about the lawsuit. Chase's parents think I come from a trashy family. This is all your fault." I remained calm, my voice level and cold. "Let's talk outside, Amber. You're making a scene." "I don't care," but she followed me anyway, still ranting as we walked out to the parking lot. "Why are you doing this? What did we ever do to you? We're family." Once we were away from witnesses, I turned to face her. "You want to know why? Fine. Look at yourself, Amber. You're 24 years old, married now, and you've never been responsible for a single thing in your life. Mom enabled you, supported you, bankrupted herself for you. And what did you do? You took and never once thought about anyone but yourself." "That's not true. I love Mom. I love our family." "You love what they give you," I corrected. "You love being the center of attention, being taken care of, never having to face consequences. That $800 dress, that was the final straw. Mom is drowning in debt because of your wedding, because of your lifestyle, and you don't even care. So yes, I'm forcing the sale of the house. And you know why? Because it's the only way Mom will learn. The only way you'll learn. Actions have consequences." Amber's face crumpled. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I didn't know." "Yes, you did," I said quietly. "You knew. You just didn't care. And now you're married to a man whose family thinks you're spoiled and irresponsible because you are. Good luck with that, Amber. You're going to need it." I left her there in the parking lot and went back to work. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter somehow. Like I'd finally said things that needed to be said years ago. The partition lawsuit moved forward. Mom tried to fight it, hired a lawyer she couldn't afford, but the case was straightforward. I was a legal owner of the property. I had the right to demand its sale. The second mortgage made the situation untenable. The judge sided with me, ordering the house to be put on the market immediately. The house sold faster than I expected. It was in a good neighborhood, well-maintained despite needing that roof. A young family bought it for above asking price cash offer. When the sale closed, the proceeds were divided according to Dad's will. 1/3 to Mom, 1/3 to Amber, 1/3 to me. After the second mortgage was paid off, after the credit card debt was settled, Mom and Amber walked away with almost nothing. Maybe $5,000 each. Enough for a security deposit on a rental, not much more. I walked away with $68,000. My third of the equity, clean and clear. I put half of it toward my student loans, wiping out a huge chunk of debt. I invested the rest. And I slept better than I had in years. Mom and Amber had to find a place to rent. They ended up in a 2-bedroom apartment in a cheaper part of town, 45 minutes from where we'd grown up. Mom had to get a second job working retail on weekends. Amber, faced with actual bills for the first time in her life, had to find steady employment. She got a job as a receptionist at a dental office, and from what I heard, she hated every minute of it. Her marriage was struggling. Chase's parents had never fully warmed to her after the wedding drama, and the financial pressure of starting their lives together in an apartment instead of the house they'd been counting on living in was taking its toll. They fought about money constantly. Amber wasn't used to budgeting, to saying no to herself, to living within her means. Chase was discovering that the sweet, fun girlfriend he dated had become a resentful, demanding wife. The extended family mostly sided against me. Aunts and uncles I barely knew sent me messages about what a terrible daughter I was, how I'd betrayed my mother, how I should be ashamed. I blocked them all. They didn't know the full story, and I didn't owe them an explanation. The only person who truly understood was Uncle Mike. He called me a week after the house sale closed. "Your dad would be proud of you," he said without preamble. He saw what was happening before he died. He worried about Denise spoiling Amber, about you carrying too much weight. He'd be glad you stood up for yourself. Those words meant more to me than anything else. I hadn't done this out of spite, though. There was satisfaction in it. I'd done it because it was necessary. Because sometimes Love means letting people face the consequences of their choices. Because I deserved better than to be the family ATM and emotional punching bag. 3 months after the sale, Mom called me. Not to yell this time, but to talk. Her voice was tired, defeated. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no, but something in her tone made me agree. We met at a neutral location, a chain coffee shop neither of us had history with. Mom looked older, more worn down. The stress had aged her. She ordered a plain coffee black, no fancy drink like she used to get. A small economy I noticed but didn't mention. "I'm not going to apologize," she said after we sat down. I did what I thought was right at the time. I was trying to give Amber what she wanted, what she deserved. "At my expense," I pointed out. "At your own expense." "Yes," she admitted. "I see that now. I see a lot of things now." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Amber's struggling. She's not happy. Chase is talking about them moving out of state for his work and she doesn't want to go. She wants me to help them buy a house and I had to tell her I can't. I have nothing left to give her. And she's angry about that. So angry." "What did you expect?" I asked, not unkindly. "You raised her to believe she was entitled to everything. That other people would always bail her out. Now she's learning different." "I know." Mom looked down at her coffee. "I ruined her. I can see that. I thought I was helping, but I was just making her weak. And I pushed you away in the process. My strong daughter. The one I should have appreciated more." I didn't know what to say to that. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and I could see the weight of regret in her eyes. "I don't forgive you," I said, finally. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I hope you've learned something from this." "I have," Mom said quietly. "I've learned that consequences are real. That money doesn't grow on trees. That I can't protect Amber from life forever. I just wish I'd learned it sooner." We finished our coffee in silence. When we left, we didn't hoog. But there was a kind of understanding between us, fragile and new. Maybe in time we could rebuild something. Or maybe not. I was okay with either outcome. 6 months after that conversation, I got promoted at work. Senior accountant with a significant raise in my own office. My boss, Margaret, a sharp woman in her 50s who didn't miss much, called me into her office to give me the news personally. "I know something happened with your family," she said after congratulating me. "I don't need to know the details. But I want you to know that I've seen a change in you these past months. You're more confident. More assertive. You advocate for yourself now. Those are the qualities that will take you far in this business. Whatever you went through, you came out stronger. Congratulations, Jennifer. You've earned this." I moved out of my tiny apartment and into a real one-bedroom in a neighborhood I'd always dreamed of living in. I furnished it slowly, carefully with things I loved rather than things I could afford. I hung artwork on the walls. I bought plants and actually kept them alive. I made the space mine in a way I'd never been able to before. I started dating again casually at first. Nothing serious. But I noticed I was different in these relationships. I set boundaries. I spoke up when something bothered me. I didn't shrink myself to make other people comfortable. Some men didn't like that. They disappeared quickly. But the ones who stayed were better quality. Men who respected strength, who wanted a partner rather than a caretaker. Amber had her baby, a girl, 9 months after the wedding. I saw the birth announcement on social media before anyone told me directly. She looked tired in the photos, holding this tiny pink bundle, Chase hovering awkwardly beside her. The comments were full of congratulations, but I could read between the lines. New baby, small apartment, financial stress, marriage problems. It was a recipe for disaster. Mom sent me a photo, a peace offering of sorts. My niece unnamed in the message, just a picture. I looked at it for a long time. A baby who would grow up in a family still learning hard lessons about money and responsibility and consequences. I felt a pang of something, not quite sadness, not quite hope. Just acknowledgement that life goes on. That new chapters begin even as old ones close badly. I didn't respond to the photo. I wasn't ready for that yet. Maybe someday I'd want to know my niece to be the aunt who teaches her about standing up for herself, about knowing her worth. But not yet. The wounds were still too fresh, the anger still too close to the surface. Instead, I focused on building my own life. I took a weekend trip to New York with friends from work, staying in a nice hotel, seeing Broadway shows, eating at restaurants I'd only read about. I paid cash for everything my money earned and saved and spent on my own joy. It felt revolutionary. I started volunteering at a financial literacy nonprofit, teaching young women about credit, debt, saving, investing, skills I'd learned the hard way that I wished someone had taught me earlier. Skills that Amber still didn't have. The work was rewarding in ways my day job wasn't. I was helping people avoid the mistakes my family had made. One year after the house sale, I sat in my apartment on a Saturday morning drinking coffee and watching the city wake up outside my window. I thought about where I'd been a year ago, standing in that parking lot telling Amber hard truths she didn't want to hear. I thought about the nights I'd spent crying, questioning myself, wondering if I'd done the right thing. I knew now that I had. Not because my family had learned their lessons, though some of them had. Not because I'd gotten revenge, though there was satisfaction in watching them face consequences. But because I'd learned the most important lesson of all. My worth wasn't determined by how much I sacrificed. My value didn't come from being useful to people who didn't appreciate me. I didn't owe anyone my life, my money, my peace of mind, just because we shared DNA. I pulled out the old key to my childhood home, the one I'd carried in my pocket for so long. I'd meant to throw it away a dozen times, but never quite managed to. Now I looked at it, this small brass object that had once meant security and family and home. It didn't mean any of those things anymore. It was just a key to a house I no longer owned, a past I'd outgrown. I dropped it in the trash can under my sink, hearing the small clink as it hit the bottom. Then I poured another cup of coffee and opened my laptop to check my investment accounts. They were growing steadily. In 5 years, I'd have enough for a down payment on my own house. A place that would be mine alone, with no one else's names on the deed, no one else's debt attached to it. They told me I'd understand when I was older. And I did understand. I understood that independence was worth more than any guilt trip. I understood that sometimes walking away was the strongest thing you could do. I understood that I'd spent 24 years trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it, and that I deserved better. I'd taken my life back. And that was the sweetest revenge of all. 2 years after the house sale, I barely recognized the woman I'd been. I'd made partner at the firm, the youngest in the company's history. My apartment had become a haven filled with books and art, and the kind of quiet peace that comes from knowing you don't owe anyone anything. I'd traveled to 6 countries funded entirely by my own carefully managed finances. I'd learned to say no without guilt, to set boundaries without apology, to walk away from situations that didn't serve me. Mom and I had settled into a distant but civil relationship. We met for coffee every few months, conversations that were polite but never deep. She'd aged visibly, the stress of those years etched into lines around her eyes and mouth. She was still working 2 jobs, still struggling, but she'd stopped asking me for help. That was progress, I supposed. She'd learned finally that I wasn't her safety net. Amber's life had become exactly what I'd predicted. Chase took the job out of state, and she'd had no choice but to follow, leaving behind the few friends she had left. They'd had a second baby, a boy this time, and the photos on social media told the story better than words could. Amber looked exhausted, resentful, trapped. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by Target basics and yoga pants. The manicured nails were chipped. The carefree smile had disappeared entirely. Her marriage was hanging by a thread, from what Uncle Mike told me. Chase worked long hours to support the family since Amber had quit her job after the first baby. They fought constantly about money, about her spending on the kids, about her mother's continued need for financial help that they couldn't provide. The fairy tale had curdled into a nightmare of suburban resentment and credit card debt. I felt no satisfaction in it. That surprised me. I'd thought I'd want to gloat, to revel in their downfall, to feel vindicated by their suffering. But mostly I just felt sad for the waste of it all. Sad for the relationship we could have had if they'd treated me with respect. Sad for my father's memory, for the legacy he'd tried to leave that we'd squandered. Sad for my niece and nephew growing up in a home filled with tension and financial stress. But I didn't feel guilty. That was the most important thing. I'd spent so many years carrying guilt that wasn't mine, shouldering blame for things I hadn't caused, apologizing for standing up for myself. I was done with that. I'd made my choice, and I stood by it. They'd made theirs, and they were living with the consequences. On the 3rd anniversary of the day, I walked out of that house for the last time. I did something I'd been putting off. I wrote them letters. Not emails or texts, but actual handwritten letters on good stationery, the kind my father used to use for important correspondence. To Mom, I wrote about forgiveness and understanding. I told her I'd finally reached a place where I could look back without anger, where I could see her as a flawed human being rather than a villain. I acknowledged her grief after Dad died, her fear of losing Amber too, her misguided attempts to keep the family together. But I also laid out clearly without apology why I'd done what I did, why I'd had to protect myself, why I'd needed to walk away. I told her I hoped she'd found some peace, some stability, some sense of self beyond being Amber's mother and my father's widow. I wished her well. I meant it. But I also made it clear that our relationship would never be what it once was, that trust once broken couldn't be fully repaired, that I'd built a life that didn't include her in any meaningful way. To Amber, I wrote something different. I was honest in a way I'd never been before. I told her I'd spent years being jealous of her, of the easy love Mom gave her, of the attention and support and unconditional acceptance. But I also told her that I'd realized my jealousy had been misplaced. She hadn't been given a gift. She'd been given a curse. Mom's endless support had left her unprepared for real life, unable to function in a world where actions have consequences and resources are finite. She'd been 24 years old before she'd had to face a single hard truth about herself or her choices. And now she was drowning in them, overwhelmed by a reality she'd never been equipped to handle. I told her I hoped she'd find strength I didn't know she had. I hoped motherhood would teach her things our mother never did. I hoped she'd break the cycle, that she'd raise her children to be resilient and self-sufficient and capable of surviving without constant support. I told her I'd made peace with never being close again, but that I wished her well anyway. I mailed both letters and didn't wait for responses. I didn't need them. The letters weren't about starting a dialogue. They were about closing a door I'd left ajar for too long, about finally completely letting go. Mom wrote back a short note 3 weeks later that said simply, "Thank you. I understand. I hope you're happy. No drama. No blame. Just acceptance." It was enough. Amber didn't respond at all. I hadn't expected her to. Life went on. I dated a man named Marcus, a civil engineer I met through work. He was steady and kind and didn't need me to save him from anything. We took things slow, both of us carrying baggage from previous relationships, both of us careful not to repeat old mistakes. After a year, he moved into my apartment. After another year, we started looking at houses together. We found one in a quiet neighborhood with good schools, even though we hadn't decided yet about kids. It had a big backyard and a front porch and room for a home office for each of us. We put down 20%, got a reasonable mortgage we could easily afford, and moved in on a sunny Saturday in May. I planted a garden. Tomatoes and peppers and herbs. I'd never had space for a garden before. Marcus built raised beds, and we spent weekends working in the soil, planning what we'd grow, talking about the future in the easy way of people who trusted each other. One evening, as we sat on our porch drinking wine and watching the sunset, Marcus asked me about my family. We'd been together almost 3 years, and I'd told him the basics, but never the full story. He'd never pushed respecting my boundaries the way he always did. That night, I told him everything. The years of being overlooked. The wedding. The mortgage. The lawsuit. The aftermath. He listened without interrupting, his hand warm in mine. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You did what you had to do. Anyone who says different doesn't understand what it's like to be used by the people who are supposed to love you. I'm proud of you." Those words, simple and sincere, meant everything. They were what Mom should have said years ago. What Amber should have understood. What my family should have recognized. But they came from Marcus instead, this man who'd chosen to love me, not despite my strength, but because of it. That summer, Uncle Mike got sick. Cancer, aggressive and fast-moving. I visited him in the hospital, bringing flowers and books and sitting with him when the rest of the family couldn't or wouldn't. He was the last real connection I had to my father, and losing him felt like losing Dad all over again. On one of my last visits, when the morphine had made him foggy but peaceful, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Your dad knew," he said, his voice rough. "He knew you were the strong one. The one who'd be okay. He worried about the others, but he knew you'd be fine." He was right. I cried then, the tears I'd held back for so long finally breaking free. Uncle Mike died 2 days later, and at his funeral I saw my mother and sister for the first time in over a year. We nodded to each other across the church, polite strangers united only by grief for a good man we'd all loved. At the reception, after Amber approached me, she looked older too, the hard kind of aging that comes from stress rather than years. Her daughter clung to her leg, a shy 3-year-old with Amber's blonde hair and Chase's dark eyes. "I read your letter," Amber said without preamble. "It took me a long time, but I read it. You were right. About everything. Mom did me a disservice. She made me weak. And I'm trying to be different with my kids. It's hard, but I'm trying. I looked at her, this woman who'd once been my little sister who I'd both loved and resented in equal measure. That's good, I said. They need you to be strong for them. I'm sorry, she said, the words clearly difficult. For what I said. For what I did. For not seeing what was happening until it was too late. I know, I said. And I meant it. I could see the remorse in her eyes, genuine and painful. But I also knew that some things couldn't be undone, some relationships couldn't be repaired. We'd taken different paths, made different choices, become different people. There was no going back. We talked for a few more minutes, awkward and careful, before she drifted away to wrangle her toddler. Marcus appeared at my side, his presence solid and comforting. You okay? He asked. Yeah, I said, and realized it was true. I really am. 4 years after the house sale, Marcus and I got married. A small ceremony in our backyard, 50 guests, simple and beautiful and completely us. Mom was invited but declined, sending a card and a modest gift with a note that said she didn't think her presence would be welcome. She was wrong, but I didn't press it. If she needed distance to deal with her own guilt and regret, that was her choice. Amber sent a gift too, a set of kitchen towels with a card that said, "Congratulations. I hope you're happy. Nothing more." It was enough. The wedding was perfect because it was ours, funded by money we'd saved together, planned according to our tastes rather than anyone else's expectations. We honeymooned in Italy, 2 weeks of wine and art and laughter. I thought about Amber's Bahamas wedding sometimes, about the stress and debt and resentment it had caused. My wedding had cost 1/10 of hers and brought me 100 times more joy. I got pregnant a year later. Unplanned but welcome. A girl we learned at the 20-week ultrasound. Marcus wanted to name her after his grandmother, but I suggested we name her after my father instead. Diana, the feminine version of Dan. Marcus agreed, immediately understanding what it meant to me. Pregnancy gave me time to think about the kind of mother I wanted to be. Not like my mother, playing favorites and enabling weakness. Not harsh and cold either, withholding love to toughen them up. Something in between. Strong but loving. Demanding but supportive. Teaching my daughter that she was valuable not because of what she could do for others, but because of who she was. When Diana was born perfect and screaming and utterly mine, I felt something shift in my understanding of my own mother. I understood for the first time how fierce the love for a child could be, how desperately you'd want to protect them from pain and disappointment and hardship. But I also understood that protection and enabling were different things. That teaching resilience was a greater gift than preventing all struggle. I didn't contact Mom to tell her about the baby. She found out through the family grapevine, Uncle Mike's widow probably, and sent a card. Congratulations on your daughter. I hope I get to meet her someday. It was tentative, hopeful, sad. I put the card in Diana's baby book but didn't respond. Maybe someday, but not yet. Amber sent a gift, a beautiful handmade baby blanket in soft yellows and grays. The card said, "For your daughter. May she be as strong as her mother." I cried when I read it, hormones and exhaustion and the weight of everything we'd been to each other and lost. I used the blanket. Diana slept with it every night, and eventually it became her security object, the thing she couldn't sleep without. There was something poetic about that, my daughter finding comfort in something given by the sister I'd had to cut out of my life to find my own peace. Life settled into a rhythm. Work and marriage and motherhood. Weekends in the garden. Holidays with Marcus's family, warm and functional in a way my own never was. Diana learned to walk and talk and assert her own will. She was fierce and independent and tender-hearted, and I saw in her a chance to break all the dysfunctional patterns I'd inherited. On Diana's 2nd birthday, Mom asked if she could visit. The message came through text, formal and awkward. "I would like to meet my granddaughter if you're willing. I understand if you're not. I won't push." I talked it over with Marcus. He left it up to me, supporting whatever choice I made. I thought about it for a week, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Mom was older now, more settled, presumably wiser. She'd been working with a therapist, according to Uncle Mike's widow. She'd acknowledged her mistakes, at least in writing. But more importantly, I was stronger now. I wasn't the desperate approval-seeking daughter I'd been. I didn't need her validation. I didn't need her to admit she'd been wrong or to apologize or to make up for lost time. I could let her meet Diana not because I owed her anything, but because I was secure enough in my own boundaries to take the risk. I invited her for lunch. One afternoon, 2 hours max in a public place where I could leave if I needed to. She showed up early, nervous and hopeful, carrying a wrapped gift and an anxious smile. Diana took to her immediately the way toddlers sometimes do with strangers who give them attention. Mom was gentle with her, careful not to overwhelm, showing a patience I didn't remember from my own childhood. We talked about small things. The weather. Diana's favorite foods. Mom's new apartment, smaller but nicer than the one she'd shared with Amber. She didn't mention the house. She didn't mention the lawsuit. She didn't ask me about my life or my work or my marriage. She just focused on Diana, on being present in that moment, on not pushing for more than I was willing to give. At the end of the 2 hours as she was leaving, she hugged me. It was brief and uncertain, but genuine. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for letting me meet her. I know I don't deserve it." No, I agreed. "You don't. But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for her. Diana deserves to know her grandmother if you can be one without the dysfunction." "I'm trying," Mom said. "I've learned. Too late for us, maybe. But I'm trying." We established a pattern after that. Once a month lunch, with Diana always in public, always time limited. Mom never pushed for more. She sent birthday cards on time. She asked permission before giving Diana gifts. She respected my boundaries in a way she never had when I was growing up. It wasn't the relationship I'd wanted as a child. It would never be that. But it was something, and I was okay with that. Amber I saw even less. Once a year, maybe at family events for Uncle Mike's widow or other relatives on Dad's side. We were polite, distant, careful not to disturb the fragile peace we'd achieved. I met her children, watched them grow in photos on social media. She'd moved back to our home state after Chase's company downsized, and they were struggling financially again, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I heard through the grapevine that she'd gone back to school, getting a degree in nursing, working towards something real, something sustainable. I was glad for her in an abstract way, but I felt no need to reach out to congratulate her, to rebuild what we'd lost. Some bridges once burned shouldn't be rebuilt. On the 5th anniversary of the house sale, I took Diana to visit my father's grave. She was 3, old enough to understand a little, but not the full weight of it. We brought flowers, yellow roses, because those had been his favorite. I cleaned the headstone, pulling weeds from around the base. "This is your grandpa," I told Diana, lifting her so she could see. "He died before you were born, but he would have loved you so much." "Where is he?" she asked in that direct way children have. "I don't know, baby. But I think wherever he is, he's proud of us." I told her stories about him as we sat there in the sunshine. About how he used to take me fishing. About his terrible jokes and his love of crossword puzzles and his strong, calloused hands that had built things, fixed things, held things together. I told her about the house he'd left us, the one he'd hoped would keep us secure and united. I didn't tell her about what happened to that house. She'd learn about family dysfunction soon enough. For now, I just wanted her to know she came from good people, that her grandfather had been kind and fair and strong, that those qualities lived on in her. Diana fell asleep on the drive home, clutching the teddy bear Mom had given her at their last lunch. I carried her inside and laid her in her bed, watching her chest rise and fall in that perfect rhythm of child sleep. This was what mattered. This was what I'd fought for. Not revenge. Not vindication. But the freedom to build something better. Marcus found me there, standing in the doorway of Diana's room, and wrapped his arms around me from behind. "You okay?" he asked, the same question he'd been asking for years, the one that meant, "I love you and I see you and I'm here." "Yeah," I said, leaning back into him. "I really am." That night, after Diana was asleep and the house was quiet, I sat at my desk and looked through the papers I'd kept from the lawsuit. The court documents. The house sale records. The check that had changed my life. I'd held onto them like proof, like evidence that I'd done the right thing, that I'd had no choice. But looking at them now, I realized I didn't need proof anymore. I knew what I'd done and why. I knew the price I'd paid and what I'd gained. I knew who I was now, and that person didn't need to justify herself to anyone. I shredded the documents, every last page, and threw them away. The sound of the shredder felt ritualistic, final. Each page disappearing into strips felt like releasing weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Then I went to bed, climbing in beside Marcus, settling into the life I'd built through choice and courage and sheer stubborn will. They said I'd understand when I was older. And I did understand. I understood that blood doesn't obligate you to accept abuse. I understood that family is supposed to lift you up, not drag you down. I understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. I understood that my father's real legacy wasn't the house, but the lesson that security comes from within, from knowing your worth, from refusing to settle for less than you deserve. I'd taken my life back from people who'd tried to define me by my usefulness to them. I'd set boundaries and held them. I'd built something beautiful from the ashes of a dysfunctional family system. And I'd learned that revenge, real revenge, isn't about making others suffer. It's about refusing to suffer anymore yourself. That was the sweetest revenge of all. Living well. Living free. Living according to my own values on my own terms with people who loved me for who I was rather than what I could give them. I'd won. Not because they'd lost, though they had, but because I'd finally learned to play a different game entirely. One where my happiness wasn't tied to their approval. One where I got to define success for myself. One where I was enough all by myself without needing anyone to validate or accept or understand me. 5 years later, I was 34 years old, a partner in a successful firm, a wife, a mother, a woman who knew her worth and defended it fiercely. I had a beautiful home and a growing savings account and a daughter who would never doubt her value. I had peace. I had joy. I had a future I'd built with my own hands. And somewhere across town in apartments I'd never visit, my mother and sister lived with the consequences of their choices, just as I lived with mine. Maybe they'd learned. Maybe they'd grown. Maybe they'd found their own version of peace. I hoped so. I genuinely did. But whether they had or hadn't, it wasn't my responsibility anymore. I'd spent enough years trying to save people who didn't want to be saved, trying to teach people who didn't want to learn. Now I focused that energy where it mattered. On my daughter, teaching her to be strong. On my marriage, building something lasting. On myself, continuing to grow and heal and become more fully who I'd always been meant to be. 10 years after that day in the lawyer's office, I received an unexpected letter. It came in a cream-colored envelope with familiar handwriting I hadn't seen in a decade. My mother's handwriting, though shakier than I remembered. For a long moment, I held it in my hand, standing by the mailbox in the late afternoon sun, feeling the weight of it. Diana, now 15, found me there. "Mom, you okay?" I looked at my daughter, tall, confident, with Marcus's eyes and my stubborn chin. She knew the story, age-appropriately edited over the years. She knew why she'd never met her grandmother or aunt. She knew about boundaries and self-worth and the difference between family and relatives. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, and meant it. Just old mail from old times. I didn't open it that day. Or the next. It sat on my desk for a week, a test I hadn't asked for but would pass nonetheless. Because the truth was, I no longer needed to know what it said. Whether it was an apology or an accusation, a plea for reconciliation, or another demand for money, it couldn't touch the peace I'd built. When I finally did open it late one night, with Marcus reading beside me, it was brief. My mother was sick, not dying, but not well. She'd been in therapy for 5 years. She'd ended her relationship with Rachel, who had her own apartment and a job, and apparently a life of her own now. Mom didn't ask for anything. She just said she understood now what she'd done, how she'd failed me. She said she was sorry. She said she hoped I was happy. She said she'd understand if I never wanted to see her again. I cried that night, not from sadness, but from the release of something I'd been holding for so long I'd forgotten it was there. The child in me who'd wanted her mother to see her, really see her, finally felt acknowledged. Not validated, I didn't need that anymore, but acknowledged. Marcus held me, asked no questions, gave me space to feel whatever I needed to feel. "What do you want to do?" he asked eventually. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "And that's okay. I don't have to know right now." I waited 3 months before responding. Not because I was punishing her, but because I needed that time to think, to feel, to decide what I wanted rather than reacting from old wounds or old hopes. I talked to my therapist, the same one I'd been seeing for years, who helped me maintain the mental health I'd fought so hard to achieve. I talked to Marcus. I even talked to Diana, who was old enough now to understand complexity, to hold space for the reality that people can hurt us terribly and still be human. When I finally reached out, it was on my terms. A coffee shop, public and neutral. 1 hour. No promises beyond that single meeting. My mother looked older, smaller somehow. The armor she'd worn my whole life, the defensiveness, the bitterness, the martyrdom had been stripped away, leaving someone raw and humbled. She didn't hug me, didn't try to. She just said, "Thank you for coming." We talked. Really talked, maybe for the first time in my life. She told me about her therapy, about the patterns she'd finally recognized. Her own childhood, which she'd never spoken of, neglectful parents, poverty, the survival mentality that had calcified into something toxic. She didn't offer it as an excuse, just as context. An explanation, not a justification. "I was so afraid of ending up with nothing," she said. I became exactly what I feared. And I lost everything that actually mattered. I listened. I didn't absolve her or minimize what she'd done. But I also didn't hold on to anger that had already been processed and released. "I'm glad you're getting help," I said. "I'm glad you're healthier. Are you happy?" she asked, and I heard real curiosity, not the loaded question it would have been years ago. "Yes," I said simply. "I really am." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "That's all I wanted to know. That you're okay. That I didn't destroy you." "You didn't," I said. And then more gently, "But I saved myself. We didn't become close. We didn't suddenly bridge a decade of distance with one conversation. But we stayed in contact carefully, slowly, with boundaries that I maintained firmly. Coffee every few months. Brief phone calls on holidays. When Diana asked if she wanted to meet her grandmother, I let her decide, supervising that first meeting with the vigilance of someone who'd learned to protect what mattered. My mother was careful with Diana. Respectful. She asked permission before giving gifts, never overstepped, never tried to use my daughter to access me in ways I hadn't invited. It wasn't the grandmother relationship I'd once fantasized about, but it was honest. And honesty, I'd learned, was worth more than fantasy. Rachel was a different story. She never apologized, never acknowledged her part in the family dysfunction. According to my mother, she was doing better working retail, living alone in therapy, but resistant to changing her fundamental worldview. She still believed she'd been wronged, that I'd stolen what was rightfully hers, that I was the villain in her story. And that was okay. I didn't need her acknowledgement. I didn't need her approval or understanding. Some people never do the work. Some people stay stuck in patterns that serve them, even as those patterns destroy them. That was her choice to make. I didn't reach out to her. Didn't leave that door open. Some boundaries I'd learned need to stay closed. On Diana's 16th birthday, I gave her a letter. Not to open now, but to keep for when she was older, when she faced her own impossible choices, her own moments of having to choose between what people expected and what she needed. In it, I told her the whole story, not the edited version, but the real one. Every betrayal, every moment of doubt, every instance where I'd almost given in to guilt or obligation or the desperate desire to make people love me by sacrificing myself. I told her about the lawsuit and the money and the choice I'd made to walk away from people who loved me conditionally. But mostly I told her this: your worth is not determined by what you give. Your value is inherent, unchangeable, yours from birth. You don't owe anyone your peace, your safety, your mental health, or your future. Not your family. Not your friends. Not anyone. There will be people who call you selfish for having boundaries. Let them. Your responsibility is not to be endlessly giving. It's to be whole. Love yourself fiercely, completely, the way you deserve to be loved all along. And never ever apologize for taking up space in your own life. She thanked me, tucked the letter away, and asked if we could go get ice cream. Because she was 16 and the world was still full of simple joys, and she'd learned from watching me that you could hold deep truths and still live lightly. 20 years after my father died, I stood in my garden, the one I'd planned and planted and tended, and realized I'd become the parent I'd needed. Not just to Diana, though, yes, to her, but to myself. The child who'd been used as a crutch and a wallet and a solution to problems that weren't hers to solve had finally been parented properly. By me. I'd given myself the security of knowing she was loved without conditions. The safety of boundaries that protected rather than imprisoned. The freedom of knowing her worth wasn't tied to her usefulness. The courage to walk away from people who hurt her. The wisdom to know that leaving dysfunction wasn't abandonment, it was survival. Marcus found me there, brought me tea without asking, sat beside me on the bench we'd built together. Diana was at college now, studying psychology, perhaps unsurprisingly with plans to specialize in family systems therapy. She called twice a week, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. Because we'd built that kind of relationship. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked. "How sometimes the family you're born into teaches you what not to do," I said. "And then you get to spend the rest of your life doing it right." He squeezed my hand. "You did do it right." "We did," I corrected. Because I'd learned that too, that accepting love, letting people in, building something together wasn't weakness. It was the opposite. It was the strength I'd built by first learning to stand alone. The story could have ended a dozen different ways. With reconciliation or continued estrangement with forgiveness, or festering resentment with happy endings or cautionary tales. But it ended here with me sitting on my porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun set over a garden I'd planted with my own hands, in a house I'd earned with my own strength, surrounded by a life I'd chosen deliberately and built carefully. My mother was alive, healthier in my life in a limited but real way. My sister was distant, perhaps forever, and I'd made peace with that. My daughter was thriving, armed with the tools I'd never had ready to face the world with confidence and boundaries and self-knowledge. My husband was beside me, my partner in building this life, this legacy, this proof that cycles can be broken. They said I'd understand when I was older. They were right, just not in the way they meant. I understood that healing wasn't linear, that you could work through trauma and still have bad days. That forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or allowing people back into your life without boundaries. That some relationships could be rebuilt and others needed to stay broken. That protecting yourself wasn't selfish, it was survival. I understood that the money wasn't the point. It had never been about the money. It was about being seen as human rather than a resource. It was about refusing to be consumed by people who should have protected me. It was about recognizing that obligation without reciprocity isn't love, it's exploitation. I understood that my father's death had been both an ending and a beginning. An ending to the hope that things might change, that I might finally be enough, that my family might suddenly see me. And a beginning to the realization that I didn't need them to. That I could see myself. That I could be enough for myself. I understood that walking away had been the hardest and best thing I'd ever done. That the guilt had been manufactured, implanted, weaponized to keep me in place. That I'd broken something sacred, not family bonds, but the cycle of dysfunction that had masqueraded as family bonds. I understood that there was no perfect ending. That my mother's apology didn't erase what had happened, and my sister's lack of one didn't define me. That I could hold compassion for their struggles while still maintaining boundaries that protected my peace. That understanding someone's pain didn't obligate me to absorb it. Most of all, I understood that I'd done what I needed to do. Not what was easy, not what made everyone happy, not what looked good from the outside, but what was necessary for my survival, my sanity, my soul. And understanding was its own kind of freedom. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Inside, I could hear Diana laughing on the phone with a friend, making plans, living the unburdened life I'd fought to give her. Marcus's hand was warm in mine, steady and present and real. I'd built this. Not just the house or the career or the bank account, but this peace, this certainty, this bone-deep knowledge that I was exactly where I needed to be, exactly who I needed to be, living exactly the life I was meant to live. They said I'd understand when I was older. And now at 44, with silver threading through my hair and laugh lines around my eyes and a lifetime of hard-won wisdom in my bones, I finally did. I understood everything, and it was enough. I was enough. I had always been enough. Years from now, when Diana has children of her own, she'll tell them about their great-grandfather's house and the inheritance that changed everything. She'll tell them about the lawsuit and the estrangement and the difficult choices their grandmother made. But more than that, she'll tell them about the garden, about the home built from ashes, about the woman who learned to love herself enough to walk away from people who didn't. She'll tell them that family is complicated, that love is complicated, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is save yourself. And if they ask whether the story has a happy ending, she'll think about me gray-haired and still fierce, still strong, still standing in my garden with dirt under my fingernails and peace in my heart, and she'll say yes. Not because everything was perfect or everyone reconciled or all wounds healed completely, but because I'd survived. I'd thrived. I'd built something beautiful from something broken. I'd transformed pain into purpose, trauma into triumph, obligation into choice. I'd taken my life back. And in the end, that was the only happy ending that mattered.